Yeah. Hello and a very warm welcome to our event on the future of social media. My name is Guntram Wolf and I'm the director of Bruegel, and it's my great honor and pleasure to host today two speakers that I think are really, I couldn't think of better speakers for this topic. First, I would like to welcome Nick Clegg. Nick Clegg is the Vice President for Global Affairs and Communication at Facebook, and has been and is, of course, at the center of Facebook's work to ensure that social media are a net positive for society. And as you know, he is also a former Deputy Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Thank you so much for joining us, Nick, today.
Thank you. It's lovely to be here.
And let me also welcome Sinan Aral. Sinan Aral is professor at MIT, and he co-leads MIT's initiative on the digital economy. And he has also, as we can see in his background, recently published a book called The Hype Machine. If you can't see his background, it's also here. It's a big book, and it's a fascinating account of both the promise but also the peril of social media. And he will give us his perspective. And following the two initial remarks, we will engage in a discussion between the three of us. And of course, I do want to hear from you, our audience, your questions. If you want to ask a question, please go on the platform Slido and type in the password social media. And then I can read your questions here on my smartphone, our connection to the social media world. Without much further ado, thank you again to both of you for joining us. It's great really to have you and to engage in that conversation, which I would argue is probably one of the most important conversations that our societies need to think and face, because social media is everywhere. Social media shapes the way we think, it shapes the way we shop, it shapes the way we receive and share information. It even shapes the way we elect and whom we elect as politicians. So really, it is absolutely fundamental for the future of our democracies, for the future of our societies, but also for the future of commerce and business. And I think it is really therefore of crucial importance to discuss this issue. There's lots of initiatives, both in the United States, but also in Europe, what needs to be done to make social media more conducive, better for democracy, more conducive for stability, for economic benefit of citizens. But there's of course also lots of initiatives within the big social media firms thinking about how to improve and make a better use of social media to the good of society. And therefore, I would like to first listen to Nick Clegg, who will give us his view, his vision of where social media are currently and where they should be going. Then I want to give the word to Sinan and then engage in the discussion. So thank you again to all of you for joining us. And Nick, let me first give the floor to you. Thanks again.
Thank you, and thank you very much for hosting this event, and thank you to your team at Bruegel. And it's a great honor to be with you, Sinan, and I'm much looking forward to the discussion of the next hour. And pleased to do so in you didn't mention my old stomping ground of Brussels, where I spent 10 very happy years as an employee of the European Commission for half a decade, and also 5 years as an MEP. And I can only reflect with sadness that on this very day there is a British negotiating team in Brussels negotiating the final steps of Britain's sad withdrawal from the European Union. But setting that aside, I think this event, focusing on social media and its future and as you put it, promise to peril and beyond, is very well timed. And it's well timed first because, as that phrase sort of promise to peril suggests, that there's been quite a striking pendulum swing, really. Certainly, I think there's quite a difference actually between the billions of users who love using social media. Self-evidently, they do so in growing numbers. But certainly amongst what I'd call elite opinion, policymaker opinion, the media commentariat. There's been a very sort of sharp pendulum swing from a several or even a few years ago, where Silicon Valley was held aloft as the answer to all of our problems. Technology was going to solve everything. Social media and the eruption of many of the other technologies associated with Silicon Valley were embraced with open arms as a sort of form of technological salvation for so many of our socioeconomic problems. Now, several years later, the pendulum has swung almost in the direct opposite direction, where almost every problem now, whether it's an election outcome you don't like, whether it's health issues you don't like, whether it's wider socioeconomic distress, is laid at the door of technology, and particularly at social media. And like all pendulum swings, and by the way, as Sinan will be able to explain more fully than I can, you always have these, or you appear always to have these very striking pendulum swings of sort of mood change, from frothy, naive techno euphoria to sort of remorseless techno pessimism. That's happened in the past around technologies. You look at the fears that were expressed on everything from the bicycle to the motor car to the radio to email. As I was telling someone just the other day, I remember when advertising first appeared on terrestrial television in the United Kingdom. I'm 53 now, so this was in the early 70s. I remember there were kids in my class who were told by their parents that they had to leave the room when advertising appeared on the television, because they thought the advertising would somehow worm its way into their precious little children's brains. And I don't want to be facetious about that, but these mood swings around technology are not new, but maybe the scale of it and the intensity of it is in keeping with the scale and prevalence of social media in the way that it's erupted in such a short period of time over the last decade or so around the world. So I think this is a very, very well-timed debate. Secondly, and perhaps more proximately, it's of course well-timed as well as we look forward to a new US administration taking office at the beginning of next year, because my own view is that clearly, and I'll come to this in a minute, clearly the internet needs new rules, needs new updated rules. Clearly, we need new guardrails, new parameters. We need greater accountability, transparency in the way in which the internet operates generally, and perhaps most especially social media. But that, of course, given this is a global industry, this is a technology which, much that it might be invented in this part of sunny California, is used by billions of people around the world, and because it's paid for by ads, it's available for free. So it doesn't matter whether you're a poor student in Guatemala or a fancy lawyer in Wall Street, you're using Instagram, Messenger, Facebook, WhatsApp on exactly the same basis. For that reason, it is so important that the EU and the US, it seems to me, find a common cause and common understanding on what is social media, what are the benefits that they want to safeguard, what are the downsides that they want to mitigate, and how do they do that all the while by keeping the internet open and not unwittingly or otherwise fostering this, what is in my view one of the most worrying trends around the world at the moment, which is this trend towards the balkanization of the internet, the fragmentation, the so-called splinternet, which is in keeping with the mood of economic nationalism that you see in one country after the next. But if you look, of course, China is the paragon of this. It has been essential to try to wall off the internet and subjects those within that walled off internet to very extensive surveillance. But if you look at developments in countries as diverse as Turkey, Russia, Thailand, Vietnam, there's a real move towards balkanizing the internet, building walls around the internet. And I think it is for the EU and the US to assume a leadership role in seeking to keep the internet open. Third and final point is, of course, very well timed in Brussels itself, where in a matter of days, I think in a week or so, according to Thierry Breton and Margrethe Vestager, the European Commission is going to publish a very significant new generation of regulations. And the European Union plays this unusual role of, whilst it doesn't have yet, at least, the tech giants to measure up to the US and Chinese tech giants, it has a giant and outsized role in setting the rules of the internet. So just as GDPR was emulated around the world, I think it's important that the European Union continues to use it or discharge its leadership role in policy and regulation, mindful that it's not just doing so for the continent of Europe, but also for many other jurisdictions around the world. And as I said earlier, regulation is undoubtedly needed, whether it's how, as you alluded to, Gunther, how elections are conducted online. That shouldn't be decided by a private American company. Europeans should decide through the democratic process how and whether they want to use platforms like Facebook and in what way for their own elections. Data portability, the ability for Europeans and others to move their data from one service to the other. That's the way you can instill greater competition. But you need regulations for that, because there's always a tension, inevitably, between data portability and privacy. Because the more that data moves around, the more likely it is, candidly, that things will go awry. So legislators, not private companies, need to sort that out. Hate speech and all the difficult, fraught issue about, remember, content that is legal, just perfectly legal, but for various reasons is considered to be undesirable or damaging. Again, Facebook has its own, I think we have undertaken some of the most sophisticated attempts by a private company to come up with our own answers. We have these community standards. We work with academics and experts around the world. We publish the revisions to those standards every 2 weeks, and they set out the 21 categories of speech that we don't allow on our platform. We take down huge amounts of content as a result. 22.5 million pieces of hate speech were removed in Q2 of this year alone. We work with 80, no other company does this, with 80 fact checkers around the world in over 60 languages. And they help us label and deprecate huge millions, hundreds of millions of pieces of content that have been fact checked. But you never catch everything, and you never satisfy everyone, because one person's hate speech is another person's right to say something offensive. And where you draw that line, again, would benefit from a democratic process. And then, of course, privacy generally. I'm a European now living in America. America, perhaps somewhat surprisingly, doesn't have its own federal privacy legislation yet. So, we clearly got several gaps still to fill, even in the basic architecture of privacy legislation, to safeguard the data sovereignty of individuals, which, and this is the final thing I want to say, is that as we draw these new rules, as we hold companies like Facebook to greater account, as we, I hope, instill greater accountability and transparency in the way in which social media operates, because we all share the same objective, which is to make sure that people feel that tech serves them, that they're not serving tech. I hope we won't allow ourselves to believe that somehow human agency and individual sovereignty has been lost altogether. I think there are lots and lots of legitimate debates and indeed criticism that can no doubt be made about companies like Facebook. But I sometimes worry that a somewhat dystopian view is being promulgated, that social media somehow has forced people to surrender any human agency and sovereignty and control over what they themselves see in their personalized individual newsfeed on Facebook. In fact, and maybe this is an argument for much greater consent and controls for individuals. In fact, I think one of the most, which is one of the reasons I'm so excited to work in this area, I think one of the most sort of thrilling things about social media is that it is one of the most unprecedented technologies of emancipation. It allows individuals to say what they want, to whom they want, when they want, without seeking the permission or authorization of the powers that be, on a scale that has perhaps not been seen for a very long time. And on the whole, I remain of the view that whilst there are real downsides, a technology which allows people to express themselves and do so freely generally has a net positive effect in society. Thank you.
Well, thanks a lot, Nick. A lot of terms that resonate, I'm sure, with Sinan, and that really are also mentioned quite a bit in his book. I mean, the issue of data portability, the issue of the transparency paradox, what kind of data can be transferred, but how do you ensure privacy? But also really content moderation, the question of content moderation and who holds to account and who manages content, which I think is one of the key questions, certainly for social media, and where social media, despite all the freedom that it gives to individuals, really also have a huge responsibility, because it is for social media that in the end determine also what feeds what kind of content gets janked up in the feed and what kind of content doesn't get promoted. And some of the content, certainly, as you have pointed out, Nick, is highly problematic. So I think this is a great start for a conversation. But let me give the floor to Sinan for really your view, Sinan, on the future of social media, but of course also on the points you want to take up from what Nick just said. Please, Sinan.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the invitation, and to Nick for his comments. I was thinking maybe Nick had read my book before arriving today, but now I wonder whether he wrote part of it, because a lot of the ideas are very similar. Look, I think that we have. I think Nick is exactly correct, and I write this in my book, that we had kind of a decade of techno-utopianism followed by a decade of techno-dystopianism. And what we really need now is to get past this debate about, is social media good or evil? The answer is yes. And we need to enhance policies, both at the platform level and at the politician level, that are going to help us achieve the promise of social media and avoid the peril. And I think we can do that. We have had 6 months of great progress on the platform side in the last year, in terms of policies, in terms of attention to misinformation, and so on. It is a welcome change from what had been happening sort of in the last 3 years or 4 years prior to that, going back to the 2015, 2016, the US election, and even the annexation of Crimea and things like that, which I write about in my book. And now the question is, will we take this opportunity in the next 18 to 24 months to systematize these responses, to scale them, to really make them permanent, and to build on the progress that we've seen in the last 6 months? So I think a lot of people forget the promise of social media. As I describe in my book, some things are quite astonishing. So for instance, people like to make fun of the ice bucket challenge, but it's hard to laugh at raising $250 million with a B for ALS research in 8 weeks. I think we forget about the fact that the leaders of the Black Lives Matter movement say that there would be no Black Lives Matter movement without social media, and that before Black Lives Matter, it was the Arab Spring, and it was the Snow Revolution in Russia, and protest movements in Hong Kong and Ukraine that are very progressive. And I think, we've done research at the IDE, which I direct at MIT, that shows that, Facebook creates $370 billion of consumer surplus every year in the United States alone. And that's just in the US. Think about that globally, and think about the fact that in some countries, Facebook is the internet. It is the access to life-saving health information. It is the access to the creation of jobs, to reskilling, to meaningful human connection, and so on. So I think that in this era, the current decade of techno-dystopianism, we forget the promise and focus on the peril. That's not to say that there aren't real challenges. And I do agree with Nick about, for instance, the splinter net. And I just want to highlight that for a minute, which is to say that the real danger of the splinter net is that we know that these technologies help form our reality. And any student of negotiation knows that in order to get cooperation and collaboration, you have to start with common ground. And if we don't have common ground, we are facing many global challenges, whether it is, push towards authoritarianism in some parts of the world, whether it's the climate crisis. And if we have whole countries that have completely different realities on these big global crisis questions, it's going to be very difficult to get global cooperation, because the politicians are going to follow the viewpoints of their constituents, which, if those are very different, it's going to have a big effect on the ability for global cooperation to address global challenges. Now, in terms of how do we adequately address the peril and achieve the promise, and I do think we have a window of opportunity now in the next 18 to 24 months to make meaningful progress on these exact questions. I think we should look at three different stakeholders: the platforms, the politicians, and the people. And I also agree with Nick that, and I say this in my book, that human agency is a big part of where we go next. It's not a foregone conclusion. The decisions we make now are going to have meaningful impacts on where we end up. So in terms of the platforms, I think three things are important. The first, I think, is transparency. Transparency is absolutely critical to any sort of progress that is made. And that includes things like making data available to researchers like myself so that we can analyze how the system works and what that means for the outcomes we see in society. I know that Facebook has made meaningful contributions, for instance, to industry academic consortia like Social Science One, although that initiative did begin with a big set of hurdles and roadblocks that ended up with the funders pulling out and so on because data wasn't delivered. And then Facebook did deliver a big trough of data. And part of the reason why it's difficult is what Nick alluded to and what I call the transparency paradox in my book, is that there are issues of privacy. And the way they solved that was by relying on differential privacy in order to release the data. That is a technical way of masking identity while releasing individual level or low level data to researchers. Those kinds of solutions are essential to achieving real transparency and not just talking about it. And I think we need more of that and sophisticated versions of that. They also have to be transparent about their rules. And I would say that Facebook has gotten much better at this in recent times. And I think that other social media platforms need to get better at this as well, rather than debating in congressional hearings a specific tweet that was or wasn't moderated, for instance, as we saw Ted Cruz question Jack Dorsey about. What we should be debating is the rules that the social media platforms should tack to the wall that everyone can read. And we should be debating about the rules and make sure that those rules are consistently and evenly applied to content moderation. The other big challenge for the platforms is obviously moderation, whether it's falsity or hate speech. There, I think there are a number of solutions that I again describe at length in my book. Labeling, which has taken a big hold in social media platforms over the last year. This is something that I called for back in 2017, 2018, and it has scaled quite a bit since then. We also could slow down information in general, which is, as Nick referred to, the slowing of the sort of reshares, for instance, on WhatsApp. We know that WhatsApp is an encrypted platform, so misinformation can spread there without people's knowledge. I know that WhatsApp reduced reshares to 5 and then to 1 to reduce the spread, for instance, of coronavirus misinformation. This is important because, as we showed in our 10-year study of the spread of fake news on Twitter, falsity travels further, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth in every category of information on social media. So slowing down information in general could help the truth catch up to falsity. Debunking never travels as far or as fast as the falsity does. And so slowing information down is important. Also, demonetization, making sure that people can't earn ad revenue against false or hate speech, public health misinformation like coronavirus misinformation. That's important. And finally, I think algorithmic transparency and choice is important. I would love to see a number of different feed algorithms that I could choose from in my Facebook feed. Do I want one that gives me more diversity? Do I want one that gives me access to different kinds of people, PYMK or friend suggestion algorithms? Show me what those algorithms are, allow me to choose between them, and perhaps then we could see more diversity in the content that people read. Now, politicians also have a big responsibility here as stakeholders. The key areas, in my mind, first and foremost, competition. Without competition, social media platforms don't have an incentive to change. And the way that we achieve competition, as I describe in my book, is through legislating interoperability and portability. So for instance, there's the Access Act sitting in front of Congress right now that would force any social media platform over 100 million users to become interoperable. Why is that important? Well, think back to when AOL merged with Time Warner. The AOL Instant Messenger was forced to become interoperable with MSN and Yahoo. It went from 65% market share to then ceding the entire market to entrants like Facebook in the messaging market. In addition, when cell phone number portability was instituted, it created a ton of competition. There's estimates and research that it created $880 million of consumer surplus every quarter for years and years because of portability. In addition, obviously privacy, federal legislation in the US, we have to think about speech moderation. There's a big debate about Section 230. I think that people misunderstand Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. It actually gives platforms the ability to moderate, because if you are subject to civil liability, you don't want to make content moderation decisions because then you're liable for them. It enables moderation. That's important. We also need legislation on election integrity in the US, things like the Secure Our Democracy Act, the Voting System Cybersecurity Act, the FIRE Act, and so on. It is astonishing to me that we haven't hardened our democracy more to manipulation and misinformation through regulation. And finally, something that I think people forget is individual users' responsibility in terms of the norms that we adopt as a society for how we use social media. We need to be better about not abdicating our own responsibility to behave well on social media. And that's something that I think needs to be discussed more as well.
Well, thanks a lot, Sinan. A lot to chew on there. I would love to, of course, get back to you, Nick, to react to some of this. But perhaps we can, before doing so, Sinan, you can spend perhaps 1 minute explaining the Crimea example from your book, because it's such a wonderful example. And then we can perhaps get from Nick also a reaction on, how the platform, how Facebook has operated and has made sure or tried to make sure that these kind of things cannot repeat themselves, be that in Crimea or be that in the US election context. So I think it would it's very tangible. That's why I think it would be very nice to hear from you quickly this example, Sinan.
Yeah, so this is the story that actually opens my book, and it is the story of sort of Russian information warfare during the annexation of Crimea. And the reason it was so important is because framing the reality of what was happening on the ground in Crimea was important to adjusting or framing the response to the Crimean annexation by the international community. And so the strategy was twofold, two-pronged. One was to flood social media with abuse reports of pro-Ukrainian Crimean bloggers to get them turned off, turned down, or banned from platforms. And the second was to spread misinformation. And I actually present new data, new evidence in my book that comes from the 10 years of Twitter history that we studied in the study that we published on the cover of Science in 2018 about the spread of falsity online. I dug into that data and specifically looked at Crimean misinformation. What I found was an unbelievable correspondence between the misinformation that was spreading on social media and what Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, was saying in public. Almost identical stories that were spreading on social media and what the foreign minister was saying in public at the UN and in other places. And in fact, these stories were essentially things like the fact that, in Crimea, the Ukrainians were going to force Jews to register as Jews, that only Russian was going to be accepted as a, Russian was going to be banned as a language in Crimea and so on. And these stories that were spreading disproportionately, statistically significantly disproportionately on social media, were the exact stories that the Russian foreign minister was elaborating in public. So this is an example of manipulation through foreign interference. And these types of things are very serious because, as we know, the Obama doctrine stopped short of intervening. And there's no doubt in my mind that the sort of framing of the reality of what was happening on the ground in Crimea is a big part of how, whether or not a country like the United States has good intelligence about what's actually happening, it constrains their geopolitical ability to act in public when that reality is framed in a certain way.
Okay, Nick, over to you, please.
Over to me on this last point, or on some of the other points that
No, I mean, I think this last point is interesting because it came out of the US elections, and it seems, and as Sinan said, I mean, we seem to have, Facebook and other platforms seem to have made huge progress in the last 6 months. So perhaps you can tell a bit about that, but also the other points, of course. I mean, the policy response would be very interesting.
First, thank you, Sinan. I will pass this on to all of my teams who've been working flat out precisely to deliver many of the changes, and I've certainly also personally been focusing on a lot of them since I arrived at Facebook a couple of years ago. So it's great to hear them acknowledged. Look, I think I work for Facebook, obviously, but I'm trying to be objective about this. I don't think any reasonable observer could say when it comes to elections, this company is now just a completely different, almost unrecognizable to what it was 4 or 5 years ago. I mean, I'll give you an example. In 2016, Facebook didn't identify and take down one foreign network that was interfering in elections, not one. Over the last couple of years, we've taken down over 200. In March to September of this year, we removed nearly 30 networks. In roughly the last year, we've removed 5 Russian, 5 Iranian, 1 targeting the US. We're now working with intelligence services, obviously, but also crucially with the rest of the industry. We now have very, very sophisticated systems and an ability to cooperate with Twitter, Microsoft, and YouTube. So we share intelligence and we identify these patterns of foreign interference. And by the way, as Sinan will recall, the vector by which foreign interference occurred in elections most was through fake accounts. We now remove millions of fake accounts a day. In 2019, we removed 6.5 billion fake accounts, and 99.5% of them were proactively identified by our machine learning systems before anyone flagged them. So look, you never win this. You can never say job done. But I think the investment, and look, quite rightly, people are often, of course, very cynical of all big companies, and perhaps most especially big Silicon Valley company these days. So you're quite entitled to ask people listening to this, well, are you putting your money where your mouth is? And here's a really interesting fact. Over the last year, the amount of new investment that's going into protecting elections, stopping foreign interference, monitoring undesirable content on our platforms, the amount of, and we're talking about billions of dollars by Facebook alone, is more than the total revenues of the company at the time of its IPO in 2012. And I challenge anyone to identify another corporate pivot which is quite as dramatic as that in terms of allocating money. And we've built up huge infrastructure, 35,000 people working on this now. As I mentioned earlier, we have community stands, we have fact checkers, we have industry-wide cooperation. And since 2016, we've had 200 elections. I mean, elections never stop. So with each election, we get better at the defenses. I mean, I remember being, shortly after I came to Facebook, I remember being in Brussels in January or February of 2019, talking to the then President of the European Parliament, President Antonio Tajani, about the protections we were putting in place for the European Parliament elections in the spring of 2019. And anyway, we had a bit of a tug of war about certain provisions around how political ads are authorized. But President Tajani was good enough after the election to say that Facebook had done a good job, and we'd done what we said we would to protect those elections from Russian and other interference. And if you want probably the best example of how the company has changed, remember a few years ago, there were those disastrous, terrible, tragic elections or events in Myanmar, where Facebook was, because as Sinan said, Myanmar is a very good example of a country where Facebook is the internet. It's not just a social media app, it is the internet. It's how people access information, speak to friends, family, conduct their business, communicate with the outside world. And clearly it is the case, from specific things like Facebook at the time not having enough Burmese speaking content moderators to a number of other resourcing decisions that Facebook was not equipped for the eruption of violence and hatred that occurred in Myanmar at the time. The Sunday after the US elections, just last month, there were other elections in Myanmar. And if you look at some of the staunchest critics of Facebook, like what we did last time, you will look that even the most vociferous critics now begrudgingly recognize that Facebook did a far, far, far better job making sure that these elections in Myanmar, the Sunday after the US presidential election, took place safely. And we had teams across the company who were, even as all the attention was focused on the US elections, who were working day and night on making sure that the Myanmar elections were conducted more safely, including, by the way, Sinan, introducing a number of very, very aggressive temporary measures, which basically, as you described, Sinan, just massively reduce the velocity with which content circulates. Now, it's a very crude tool because you're also basically slowing down the content of totally legitimate speech. So it's not something you want to do in normal times, but it is something we did because of the exceptional circumstances in those elections. So look, I'm proud of the work we've done, but I don't want to be in any way complacent or imagine that there won't be mishaps in the future. But I do want to respond to, very clearly state that the pivot, the change that has gone on in this company when it comes to elections over the last several years has been very dramatic and accelerated a lot in the last few months. There were many other things that Sinan said that we're furiously agreeing with each other here, but I probably shouldn't go through them item by item, otherwise we won't have any time for questions, but maybe I can pick up on them later.
So perhaps indeed, I do want to talk a bit about the policy response and what politicians should be doing and what would be appropriate, and also get your response to that. But Nick, but before doing so, let me chip in one question from the audience, because it connects to the issue that you mentioned, which is the issue of removing fake accounts. And here's a person who's asking, well, do you think that making each social media user identifiable with his or her ID number could improve the overall experience? That is also something, by the way, that I think the president of the German parliament, Wolfgang Schäuble, at some stage has mentioned as a possibility. So really, making basically when you sign up for a Facebook account, well, force that person to actually reveal the national identity number. Would that be an approach?
Well, look, Facebook operates slightly differently to other services. We don't allow anonymity on our services. You can't just you can't be anonymous on Facebook. And we believe that people should be open about their identity. So to that extent, I think sort of philosophically we agree. Intuitively, I have to say I'm an old-fashioned sort of liberal. I worry terribly about people's ability to control their own data and their own privacy and so on. I do worry a little bit about the idea of a big private company hoarding huge amounts of public ID, passport numbers, ID numbers and so on at huge scale. You need to be very careful how you do that, and you'd be very careful that you don't create what privacy advocates call the honeypot effect, where you just create a lot of very valuable personal or indeed, as I think is being suggested, government-sponsored ID in the hands of a private company, which, like all data can be kept safe, but it can also be invaded by hackers and criminals and others. So and look, there's one other thing which I would mention is that for a lot of people, particularly those in authoritarian states, repressive regimes, or those where there isn't an acceptance of gay rights, of transgender rights, of the rights that we take for granted in Europe and America, there is quite a significant importance to allow people to express themselves on social media without being tracked down. And I think you need to tread quite carefully there, because we mustn't have how can I put it, a sort of unduly Western-centric view of this. For a lot of people, social media is a fantastic tool of emancipation, precisely because they can express themselves without having someone knock on the door from the authorities the next moment. So I think it cuts both ways, to be honest.
Sinan, did you want to react to this point?
Well, I mean, I think that in terms of the issue of identity and false accounts, for instance, one thing we have to note is that, for instance, manipulators are always evolving. So vigilance is essential. So we saw in the 2020 election that Russia did a number of things to evolve since 2016 in response to Facebook's, for instance, new platform policies against inauthentic accounts and more enforcement of those policies and so on. And what they started doing was nudging real American citizens to spread misinformation, or taking things that originate from true accounts and amplifying those true accounts. And we see this in falsity in general. We've also seen, for instance, Russia infiltrating Iran's cyber war department, perhaps to launch attacks made to look like they came from Tehran, and so on. So adversaries will always evolve, and vigilance is therefore essential. No one policy here is a silver bullet. It is a constant, I don't want to say struggle, but it's something that we have to strive to be better at every day.
Okay, let's talk a bit about the policy response. So we've talked about the platform response, but let's talk a bit about the policy response. And I think, Sinan, you already laid down a few points that are, of course, on top of the agenda. One dimension is competition policy. Another dimension is interoperability and data portability. And then there is, of course, privacy legislation, and how to make sure that privacy legislation allows for data portability and ensures, and then the third point was, I think, election integrity. Nick, would you like to respond to some of those, given their importance also in the current debate?
Sure. I mean, very quickly on Sinan's first point about transparency, and particularly the ability to share in a privacy protective way significant, meaningful data sets with researchers, I 100% agree. And the social science one project that Sinan refers to, I won't go into the details, but it was like one step forward, two steps back. It was just proving to be really difficult to square this circle. And by the way, look, I don't plead this in mitigation, but it's worth observing that Facebook is a company that was rightly traumatized by the events of Cambridge Analytica, which, let's remember, started with an academic. It was an academic legitimately taking data from Facebook through the then much more kind of open and unguarded arrangements that were in place to allow researchers to take data, or indeed developers to take data. That's now being replaced with an armory of new APIs which regulate how data is moves into the hands of researchers and developers. And he then, of course, illegitimately sold that data on to Cambridge Analytica. I mean, thankfully, just parenthetically, the UK Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, which is the only body that actually has that Cambridge Analytica data, Facebook doesn't have it, published its report recently, and thankfully made clear that none of the data, for instance, there was no UK data involved at all in the Brexit referendum. And in fact, the ICO implies that Cambridge Analytica was making fairly specious and exaggerated claims about what they could do about the data. And they weren't really very clear that any of it was used to great effect in the US election either. But anyway, the point was, for a company like that, you've got to understand there is a legitimate degree of nervousness about handing data sets to others without being absolutely sure that it's going to be kept in a privacy protected way under, so to speak, lock and key. We have, I hope, made a very significant advance in a new project, which we hopefully will see the first fruits of in the spring of next year, where we've given significant access to data to a network of academics to research the link between social media and voter behavior in the 2020 in the US elections, which have just happened. And we have undertaken to provide that data in a privacy protected way to a network of academics. We've also undertaken that we won't have any influence over what they publish, how they publish, when they publish, and so on. And I hope they will produce the first fruits of their examination of that data, which is the first sort of significant research project of its kind. Labeling and so on. Yes, I agree. And Sinan observes we've become much more proactive in labeling, not least in the last US elections. And by the way, Sinan, you refer to the reduction in the number of limits that where you can forward WhatsApp messages, and also greater visibility for WhatsApp users, so that you can see when something you've received is the result of being forwarded on from somebody else. We're applying that also to Messenger on a worldwide basis. So both Messenger and WhatsApp now, we've significantly constricted, and it seems to have had a very dramatic effect in the misuse of WhatsApp as a sort of broadcast tool. We don't want Messenger or WhatsApp to be used as a sort of broadcast tool. They are intimate messaging apps. I think over 90 or 95% of WhatsApp messages are still one person to one person. On algorithmic choice, Sinan, music to my ears. I really strongly agree. I really hope we can do something more on this in the future. I really agree with you. I think if you were to say to users, look, if you don't want the personalized newsfeed, personalized through this interaction between your choices and the algorithmic ranking and recommendation system, if you want it instead chronologically, press the button here. Or if you want to do it you only want to see stuff from your favorites, press a button here. We've actually made a significant amount of progress on this, but I hope we'll have more to say on this in the next period of time. My own view, but it's just my own view, is that sometimes it is forgotten that the biggest signal that Facebook and the algorithmic system uses is the signal of what people choose themselves, the groups they're members of, and the biggest signal of all, of course, is the friends you have. I mean, that's why Facebook is so different to an open-ended recommendation engine, because it's bounded by the friends you choose on Facebook. That's the biggest single, signal that the algorithm uses. But if people don't want that, as Sinan said, and if people want to rank it in a different way, I think the more we could give people those opportunities, the more that they would feel, I hope, that they are in control. The only point I quick make is just a technical point. I think data portability, I agree with that. That's in many ways is a holy grail. And we've worked with Google and other companies on the data portability project. We've introduced recently new tools for data portability, for instance, on photos. That's the easy end of it. I think interoperability is a great idea. It's really, really tough in practice, because you're trying to make dissimilar systems interoperable, which is very, very tricky indeed.
Yeah, I mean, if I can just push you on, because there were two questions which I think are exactly on your last 2 points. On the one question really on what else can you do on data portability, also with a view to introduce more competition between different platforms and therefore give more choices to consumers and reduce, in a sense, the strong, perhaps dare I say, almost monopoly power you have, the lock-in power you have over consumers that are in your system and can't move because they can't move the data. So that was one question by a person here. And the second question that I wanted to ask, to the point that you made before on the algorithm, here's a person called Niklas saying, well, social media firms have incentives to make their platforms as addictive as possible and really shape the algorithms to be very addictive. Should regulators treat algorithms the way they treat booze and cigarettes?
So on the first, look, I think the first point to make is the barriers to entry into a data-driven industry are very, very low. I mean, there's a reason why TikTok has erupted in recent months. There's a reason why everybody in this call will have lots and lots of apps on your phone where you're giving the same data to lots of different apps. Data, I always think it's been deeply misleading, this analogy of data is like oil. It's nothing like oil at all. Oil you suck out of the ground and you burn it up and then it's gone. Data is infinitely elastic, replenishable, repeatable, which is one of the reasons why you actually do have companies exploding in this space at great speed. TikTok is only the latest example. Just ask yourself, of the kind of things that Facebook operates, do you not have choice on messaging? WhatsApp and Messenger. We're not even the largest messenger in the three largest economies in the world, Japan, China, and the US. iMessage is considerably bigger in our home market. Do you not have choice in terms of video sharing? Huge numbers of apps where you can do that. On messaging, on video apps, on all forms of sort of communication, photo sharing. There is a lot of there's a lot of function by function competition, but crucially, the barriers to market entry in the data economy are remarkably low, because it's so easy for consumers just to, as they do, to share their data over and over again. Look, I know this allegation is made, and it's very much part of the zeitgeist, and you see it in Netflix movies like Social Dilemma and so on. And of course, it's a great thing to say. I can see why it's a great refrain. Oh, look, Facebook is in the attention economy. It's got an incentive to engage people by giving them addictive or somehow unpleasant material to keep them hooked. Actually, our research, it shows almost exactly the reverse. If we were to spoon feed people deliberately hateful, divisive content, our research shows that, yes, like all emotionally impactful content, which is, by the way, the reasons why tabloid newspapers always have very emotionally impactful headlines, because it grabs the attention. It'll grab your attention. It doesn't retain your loyalty. It doesn't keep users coming back. That's why we've massively minimized the amount of hate speech the prevalence of hate speech on our platform. It needs to go further, but total prevalence of hate speech on our platform is about 0.1 to 0.11%. So that means 10 to 11 views of hate speech for every 10,000 views of content. But we want to get that. I don't think we'll ever get it down to zero, but we want to get it down lower. Why? Because actually our research shows, firstly, the people who pay our lunch, the advertisers, don't like it. So why would we do something which the people who actually pay for the business model don't like? And crucially, our users don't like it. If you want a sustainable long-term business, not a short-term frothy business, of course you want to build behavior where the experience is positive and meaningful. It's why in 2017 or so, before I came to Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg took this decision to significantly change the ecosystem of content on Facebook and eliminated a huge amount of clickbaity content. Actually, I think Facebook's share price plummeted by the biggest amount it ever had done. And we alighted on something called meaningful social interaction, where you take signals, as I said, principally based on who your friends are, who your groups are. So I don't think there's the incentive for the company to do what the critics often allege that it is doing.
Okay, on this point, let me bring in Sinan, because you've researched this issue also quite a bit. Please.
Yeah, thank you. I sort of wish this conversation was 4 hours long, because I think now we're just getting into really the meat of some of these. So I want to just quickly touch on a few things that Nick said, just to sort of give a little bit more flavor to it. So it's true that Facebook did this study that they published in Science that showed that essentially, it's the people's choices that affect their, the polarization of their content more than the algorithms. However, and he said it's because, the friends that you have are sharing that content with you, and that's what's sort of creating. But the problem with that analogy is that it's the PYMK, or people you may know, or friend suggestion algorithms that are largely determining who you're connected to in the Facebook network. And those are typically recommending friends of friends, because that dramatically simplifies the engineering challenge of picking from the 3 billion people someone to recommend to somebody. So there is another algorithm behind the feed algorithm, which is determining the structure of the social network, and that's the people you may know algorithm, and that then affects what content you see, even if the feed algorithm isn't part of that quote unquote choice. Now, in terms of interoperability being difficult to do, I think that we could actually think about a stack of messages that could be relatively consistent and standard. I mean, you see Twitter coming out with fleets now. That's just stories. We've got about 5 different types of very standard commoditized messaging formats that could easily be shared and interoperable between platforms. And then the platforms could build proprietary messaging formats on top of that, where you would have a standard stack that you could message to and from any platform. And there are a number of similarities between the messaging types. I think interoperability is achievable, and then customization could be built on top of that. Now, Nick says data is not the oil, and look at TikTok. I agree, but let's not forget that this economy runs on network effects. And when network effects are present in a social economy, it tends towards concentration because the larger players are going to create more value. So in order to deal with a network effects driven economy, that's why interoperability is so important. If you break up the market leader in an economy run by network effects, it will just tip the next market leader-like company into dominance because you haven't structurally reformed the economy. The economy being interoperable is what creates competition. The rest of it is sort of more cosmetic. Now, algorithmic choice, Nick, I'm very glad you agree. I don't think the choices should just be feed or reverse chronological. I think we could have something in the middle where I could choose a knob. I want more diversity of opinion in my feed. I want more, something that opposes what my viewpoint is in my feed, rather than either take our feed or reverse chronological as my only two choices. And I want to end with the transparency paradox, which is where we began. This in 2018, I gave an interview to Martin Giles of MIT Tech Review, where I said, look, we are simultaneously asking social platforms like Facebook to be open the kimono, show us how it all works, and we're asking them to be private and secure all at the same time. This is an incredibly difficult needle to thread. And in order to do this, in order to thread this needle, they're going to have to be simultaneously more open and more secure at the same time. And the way you do that is with, for instance, differential privacy, which is exactly what they use to eventually release data to Social Science 1. You have to kind of thread the needle of the transparency paradox to solve that problem. I also agree that this engagement hype cycle is the short game. The long game is authenticity. That's what creates loyalty in consumers. What I think, just to end, what I think is that the true leaders of the new social age will be the ones that realize that the long-term shareholder value in these social platforms are the ones that align with society's values. That the short-term profit-seeking of false news and hate speech and so on may be short-term profit maximizing, but it is not long-term shareholder or profit maximizing because it faces a regulatory and a societal backlash, which is what we're seeing now. The true leaders of the new social age will be the ones that see this and institute this in their platforms.
Can I just, sorry, because just the last point that Sina made is, of course, you're 100% right, of course, in the long run, you can't, if you have a collision between these industries and societal norms will always win out. The problem is, societal norms are not homogenous. There isn't societal consensus in this highly polarized, particularly in the US, I mean, look at the way in which, and you know this, as an American, look at the way in which Facebook is now being accused of diametrically opposite, mutually exclusive sins by the right and the left in the US. So in the right, for those who don't know, there is an absolute passionate view that Mark Zuckerberg single-handedly censors right-wing Republican views. And that's why, by the way, lots and lots of Trump supporters are now apparently fleeing to Parler and other apps which are less moderated. And then on the other side, and this is reflected in the sort of the centre-left mainstream press, the New York Times, and so on, there is the allegation that somehow Facebook doesn't take down enough stuff. Those two things are mutually exclusive. They're held by the same people who share the same social space. So for a private company, I agree with you, it'd be wonderful if there was a straightforward consensus on these societal norms. But on something as sensitive as speech, particularly political speech, it doesn't actually currently exist, or doesn't at least exist in the stable way that one would like.
And probably in every country, there's different sensitivities and different societal norms, which makes it difficult to not have a fragmented global internet, I guess, at some stage. But that's perhaps for further debate. I would love to go on, and I don't know, we probably don't have time. There was a very relevant question, I think, on whether we need to update our merger policy as regards Facebook, Instagram, Facebook, WhatsApp. If you have just a one-liner to, because I think it's a question that, especially for a Brussels audience, is quite important. Nick, if you want to say just one word on that, and then I think we want to conclude.
Well, we will see how it's going to be updated by the Digital Markets Act when that's published on the 15th. But look, I will echo a little bit what Sinan said, is that this focus on the idea that the solution to all these difficult dilemmas on privacy, on speech, on algorithms, on ranking, on human control can be all delivered by simply splitting a company up. I think it misdiagnoses. Let's say you split Facebook up and you say you can't have Instagram, you can't have WhatsApp. That doesn't remove any of these issues. It doesn't change Russian interference. It doesn't change polarization. It doesn't change hate speech. None of them. And in fact, as Sinan said, the network effects will simply mean that you're playing whack-a-mole with the next big company. So if it's just people don't like the fact that lots of people use Facebook, they should be open about it. Is it just they don't like the size? Because what I worry about it is that by applying a breakup lens to these complex sort of societal issues that we've just alluded to here, you're applying a sticking plaster to something which needs different solutions. And my own view is, in the long run, actually, difficult, painstaking work on regulation, forensic regulation, is what's needed. Not the sort of attention-grabbing idea that if you break a company up, you've solved all these problems, because you won't have done.
Yeah, I think that sounds very close to, Sinan, also what you write in your book. So I'm afraid we do not have more time. We could go on, as you said, for 4 hours. But we don't have that time. So thank you so much to both of you for a wonderful discussion, a discussion that for sure will have to continue. Thank you all for our listeners for joining, and thank you to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.